Welcome to Uniquely Female Troubles. My name is Leslie Wells. In a comment, I got a very kind comment the other day on the last video that I put out, and in that comment, I was asked to make a video about me joining the cult I joined and living in it and getting out of it. And so I'm going to tell that story today. But I'm going to actually tell the story going all the way back quite a few years before I joined the cult because it's all kind of relevant. So, when I was, first of all, I was not raised in a religious home. And my mom and dad had a Bible, and they stuck things in it like a bookmark I made when I was in kindergarten, and newspaper clippings if it had a picture of a family member, and there was a little thing of hair of one of my cousins in there. I always remember that. But it wasn't something that anybody read. That wasn't anything like that. And so we didn't go to church, and we didn't really talk about God or anything. I mean, I just knew, just the general things that just from living in this country that about God, but that's it. I didn't know anything else. But when I was 8, we lived in a town, North Bergen, New Jersey, and I walked right past a big, huge church. I think it was an Episcopal church, to walk to school every morning. And some friends of mine went to that church, and they invited me to go, friends from school. And I did end up going to that church with them, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. But we ended up moving away from North Bergen, and we moved, when I was 10, we moved to a town called Lake Hiawatha. And I still had the good memories of going to church in that big fancy church in North Bergen. So I had noticed a bus picked up a friend of mine and her little brothers and her mom every Sunday morning and took them to church. And one day they invited me to go. And remembering how fun it was back in North Bergen, I said yes. Well, this was a very different kind of church. This was a Baptist church, and it was a very scary, scary place. They use fear, and I know I was a very sensitive child, and I was pretty serious. I paid a lot of attention to things that were going on around me. I wasn't just sitting there twiddling my thumbs like, oh, when are we going to get to go home? I was really listening to what they said. And even though I don't really remember exactly how they ran it. I mean, I know I was in a Sunday school class with kids. I don't really remember if I was in children's church or if I listened to the adult sermon. But I do know I was in grown-up church for the altar calls. And they had an altar call every single Sunday morning. And I don't know if it was the first altar call or it was very soon after I started going there that I got really scared. And yeah, I mean, the preacher would say stuff like, just because you're a kid doesn't mean you're not gonna die soon. And babies and children die every second of every day, of every minute of every day. And don't think that just because you're young, you're not going to die. And they were talking about all kinds of things I didn't even ever hear about in that church, but that I went to when I was 8 years old, like about this thing called the rapture. And the rapture sounded really scary. The version of it that I had in my mind was that one day, with no warning at all, Jesus was going to come to the clouds, and then he was going to make all of his children come up in the air, just rise up in the air and meet him in the clouds. And the thing that made that scary was that a lot of people, and they really emphasize this, that a lot of people who were not his children, but thought they were, would be left on the earth. And they wouldn't be taken away in the rapture. And it was also really scary because they had a picture in the hallway that I had never seen before. But I know this is a famous picture. I don't know, just in Baptist churches or what, but it was a really scary picture. And it showed Jesus up in the sky, and it showed all these people like flying, kind of like slow motion rockets up to him. But it showed airplanes crashing because the pilot got raptured, and it showed cars crashing, and it showed all these graves that were opened up, that the people in the graves had come out of the graves because they were God's children too. And so they got to be in the rapture even before the people who weren't in the graves did. And so that was a really scary picture for me. And also, they really emphasized that you had to make sure you were right with God. And if you weren't right with God, even if you thought you were right with God, that in no way meant you were going to be in the rapture. And then they would talk about all the terrible things that were going to happen to the people who weren't in the rapture. So obviously, I know now they believed in like a pre-tribulation rapture. But they taught a lot about the tribulation, which I'd also never heard of. And in the tribulation, there would be these really horrible people who belonged to the Antichrist. And they were going to go around and they were going to put 666 on people's foreheads and on their hands. And I used to sit there pondering, like, how are they going to do that? Is it going to be like a tattoo? Or is it going to be permanent marker? Like, does permanent marker come off? Like, if after you take like 1,000 showers or whatever, I used to just ponder, like, how are they going to get those numbers on people? And I did know that if you didn't let the Antichrist, and there was also this scary thing called the beast, put his number on you, then you would, like, they would hunt you down and kill you and torture you. And also you would probably starve to death because you wouldn't be allowed to buy food and stuff. And they talked a lot about how, like, two people could be right next to each other and one would be raptured and one wouldn't be raptured. So, like, maybe I would be walking with my mom and my mom would be raptured and I would be left here and I would have to survive the tribulation. And it was just really scary. I mean, I was freaking out on the inside. I specifically remember walking down this very, 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 felt like 10-mile long aisle right down the middle of the church. And I went up in the altar call. And when the preacher, when he got to me and he put his ear right up by my mouth, so close to it that it felt weird. I didn't like it. Not that he was doing anything wrong. I'm not saying that at all, but it just made me very uncomfortable. And he said why. He asked me why I came down, and I said in his ear that I want to get saved from my sins. I want to repent from my sins and get saved. And so then he turned me around to face the congregation, and he told everybody to lift up their heads, because before they have an altar call, they tell everybody, bow, every eye closed, every head bowed, and they are playing Just As I Am real softly on the organ and everything, just getting the setting just right for this dramatic, thing. And he told everybody to look up, and he turned me around to face the congregation, and he put both of his hands on my shoulders, and the longer I stood there, the more it felt like he was pushing me down, which I don't think he was pushing me down. I think it was just the weight of his hands on my shoulders. I was only about 10 or maybe 11. I think I was 10. But he told them all that he wanted them to see me, that even though that they might think, like, what is a little child like this little girl have to repent from, but that God has moved in my heart, and that I know that I'm a sinner and that I do have to get right with God, and that they might think, well, what sin has this little child committed, but that we've all committed sins and we were born sinful. And he just went on and on and on, and everybody was staring at me, and it was really embarrassing. And so finally they Then he put his hands on my head, on top of my head, and he started praying for me for what felt like forever. And again, his hands, it felt like he was trying to push me down to the ground, but I don't think he was. But oh, it felt so good when he finally took his hands off my head. And, he still wanted everybody to look at me. He was making an example of me that, that God was moving in my heart. And so then I kept going back, and I thought it was such a good thing. And I asked my dad to get me a Bible, my mom and dad, and my dad went to the store and he got me that. It's a very well-known picture. It has, it's a King James Bible. It wasn't like a children's Bible, but it had a children's cover. It's a bright blue cover, and it shows Jesus, and the children are coming to him, and he's smiling, and they're sitting on his lap, and he's got his arms around them, and it's a very sweet cover. And so I had that Bible, and I started taking it to church with me, and I actually started reading it. My friend across the street and I, we had notebooks where we wrote down Bible verses and stuff, and we were so young. And then my grandmother came down to visit, and she found out what I was doing, and she didn't approve. I mean, she did approve, but she didn't approve. She liked the idea that I was going to church. And this was my dad's mom. She liked the idea that I was going to church, but she said if you study the Bible too much, you'll go crazy. And I thought that was one of the weirdest things I ever heard anybody say in my life at age 10. I know now what she meant, but I certainly had no idea what she meant then. And that wasn't what anybody at church said. At church, they said you should study the Bible all the time, and that's the main thing you should do is pray and read the Bible and everything. And then hear my grandmother saying that if I read the Bible too much, I'm going to go crazy. And then I was also really worried about my mom and dad because I didn't want them to go to hell, and I didn't want them to miss the rapture. So I started searching through all my parents' books, and they had a lot of books, which is something I love about my mom and dad. They read all the time, and they taught me to love to read, and I still love to read. But there were no Christian books, and there were no Bibles, other than that one that was up on a high shelf that had dust all over it, and that had all these newspaper clippings and all things that if you even tried to open it, everything would just fall out. It was really obvious it wasn't a book there for reading. So I asked my mom if Jesus lived in her heart. And I don't remember exactly what she said, but it was something along the lines, well, I try to live a good life, and, and I try to, I just try to live a good life, and, that's all God can expect. Well, that's not what they said at church. And then I asked my dad if Jesus lived in his heart, and my dad was always the funny guy. And he's like, Jesus, are you in there? And he made a joke out of it. And I knew that I never saw my mom and dad read the Bible. My mom and dad never went to church, and my mom and dad never prayed. I asked them if I could start praying when we ate, and they said yes. And I always said, God is great, God is good. Let us thank him for his food. And amen. And we did that at I asked them if we could do that, and they said yes. And they were okay with us going to church. The other kids were too little at that time to go without a grown-up. But as long as I had a way to get to church, I was allowed to go. The church in North Bergen I walked to, because like I said, it was so close to our house that I walked right past it every time I walked to school. And then the church in Hiawatha I rode the bus to. So they were okay with that. And what they didn't know is what was actually happening there, which is sad because I've talked to my mom since then, and she told me that at that time she had no idea anything bad could happen to a kid at church. Church is the best place a kid could be to be safe. And what's really tragic about that is how untrue that actually is. I was never assaulted at church, and I was never in any way, nobody did anything sexual towards me at church. But just what they were doing to my mind was terrible, because every single time they had an altar call, which was every single Sunday, I had a panic attack. And I know now that's what it was, because I told my first therapist about the feelings I had. I'd get really hot and sweaty, and my heart would pound, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. And he said, well, you're definitely having a panic attack. And I did. I had a panic attack every single Sunday. And I thought those feelings were God telling me that I didn't do it right, whatever that means. That somehow, some way, even though I knew that I had gone up in the altar call, I had somehow not done it right, and I wasn't forgiven for my sins. And that was a very terrible feeling. So, and I cannot remember if I went in a bunch of altar calls or if I just went in this one altar call to get saved. But I do remember the panic attacks. And I remember also I would invite my friends to come to church with me. And then I would try to get them to go in the altar call because I wanted them to get saved. I didn't want them to go to hell, and I didn't want them to be in the tribulation. So, and then one day they started saying that if you have a loved one who's not saved, you should go in the altar call for them. Well, right away, I think my mom and dad. So when they had the altar call, I went up to the front, and the preacher made an example of me again. And he had me turn around. You know, every head was bowed, every eye was closed, supposedly. And he had them look at me, and he said that he told them why I was there. And I told them I wanted prayer for my mom and dad because I wanted them to get saved. And so he told them why I was there and about how God was using me and all this stuff, which made me feel really special, but it also made me feel really embarrassed. And so it was very weird. And then he prayed, and I don't think he put his hands on my shoulders and my head. If I don't remember him like crushing me again. And then he told me to stay up there after church, and they wrote down my address. And I don't know how many days later, after dinner, there was a knock on the door. And it was two people from the church, a man and a woman. And they told my parents that I had asked them to come and talk to them about God. My parents are very polite, and they came in. The people came in our house, and they sat down in the living room, and I'm not sure how long they were there. Feels like maybe like an hour, but who knows. And my parents were very nice to them, very polite, but they made it really obvious they were not interested. And then they like, okay, well, thank you, you know. And so the people left, and when they shut the door, they both turned around and looked at me, and they were like, do not ever do that again. Do not ever have somebody come here and try to tell us about God. And I felt really bad about that. I felt bad in a lot of ways. I mean, I felt bad because, you know, my parents were obviously annoyed with me. If not angry, I don't know if they were angry. But I also felt bad that they had such a negative reaction to the idea of talking to somebody about God because I was really worried about them. I didn't want them to go to hell. And that seemed like is what was going to happen. So I lived with that, and I became more and more afraid because every single Sunday they harped on the fact that there's no guarantee that you're going to take your next breath. And I don't know if I imagined this or if I remember this or what, but I specifically remember learning that you don't have to fly in an airplane to die from a crash because the airplane can land on your house. So then I got to the point where I was really scared of airplanes. If I heard the sound of an airplane, I just figured it probably would just fall out of the sky and crash right into our house and kill all 6 of us. But anyway, it didn't. And then I wanted to get baptized, but my parents said no. They said I was too young. So when I was 12, we moved away from that town and we moved to Georgia. And during the first few years that we lived in Georgia, let me see, I was 12 when we moved there. So I went to different Baptist churches, and I'm not sure why it was always a Baptist church, but my cousin, who was, I think, 15 years older than me, he was a Baptist preacher, and my papa, who is my mom's dad, he was a primitive Baptist preacher, and I don't know if that's why I always went to Baptist churches. I don't remember anybody ever telling me that I had to go to a Baptist church, but that was always the kind I was in when I was in a church. So I did end up getting baptized, and I got baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, which is the way most churches baptize. And I didn't go to church all the time. I went to different churches. Sometimes I rode a bus to church. Sometimes I went with, there was a friend of mine who went to church regularly, and her parents would pick me up in the morning, on Sunday mornings, and bring me back home afterwards. And, but then when I was 15, I fell madly in love for the first time. First time I was ever in love. And that really distracted me away from anything that had to do with God. I was all about this boy. I wasn't about God anymore. And I don't really know if that relationship pulled me away from God, or if I already wasn't going to church. I mean, going to church, it would be sporadic. I would go every week for a while, and then I wouldn't go. I mean, the only reason I was going was because I was going and because I wanted to go. Nobody was making me. So there were times I didn't go, times I did. And so what happened is I fell madly in love with this guy, and he said he loved me, but he ended up moving away to a totally different part of the country. And we kept in touch by phone, which wasn't easy because he had to call me on a payphone and put a lot of money in to talk to me from a different state, because cell phones weren't a thing, or if they were invented, they certainly weren't anything anybody had that I don't remember even knowing there was ever such a thing as a cell phone. And back then also it was very expensive to talk long distance. It was quite a bit of money. And so it wasn't something people like in our income bracket did just casually. So we were in touch. But then he became a Christian in his state. And then he ended our relationship. And that was the first time I experienced that kind of heartbreak. But before, on the very last phone call we had, he told me, read the Bible. I want you to read the Bible. And he was so excited about God and the Bible and being a Christian and everything. And I don't really know what happened to him. I don't know if he, I don't know. But anyway, so in between crying and in between wishing I could just go to sleep and never wake up because of my broken heart, I was reading the Bible. And to backtrack a little bit, when I was 13, I met my best friend in Georgia. And she belonged to a very strange church. And her church, women weren't allowed to wear pants or cut their hair. I never heard of such a thing before. And there were other things. I don't even remember all the details, but so I had this friend, and she was friends with me before I met this guy, during the time I knew this guy, and after the time I knew this guy. And she knew what was going on. And so one day she called me, and I'd been reading the Bible, and we started talking about the Bible, and she started showing me all this stuff in the Bible. And I was really surprised. I had no idea that she knew so much about the Bible. And she showed me in the Bible where it says women aren't supposed to wear pants. And that is in Deuteronomy 22:5. And I'm going back and forth in time a little bit because I totally bought it hook, line, and sinker that verse meant you weren't supposed to wear pants. But it doesn't say that. Back when that was written, nobody wore pants. Men wore men's clothes, women wore women's clothes, but it wasn't a matter of pants or dresses. So, but that verse says that, it says that a man shall not wear a garment that pertains unto a woman, and a woman shall not wear a garment that pertains unto a man. So I was just blown away. Like, wow, how come I haven't ever heard about this before? Then she showed me in the New Testament, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, where a woman isn't supposed to cut her hair. And again, I no longer believe that passage means that, but she showed it to me, and she told me that that's what it meant. And when I looked at it, with her explaining it to me, that's what it seemed like it meant. Then she started telling me about this man that she called Brother Branham. And that man is named William Branham. And she told me that he was the one who was a prophet and he understood all these things. And that was how she knew these things. But the thing, it's so funny because the thing that she showed me that really sealed the deal is that the Magi did not show up at the stable when Jesus was a baby in the manger. The Magi were not there. And that is true. That is what the Bible says. The shepherds were there. But the Magi didn't show up for a long while. And the Bible actually says that the Magi, who were the ones that came with the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, that they came to the young child in the house. So, and it makes sense because they were following a star. And the star, it was a supernatural star, supposedly, that showed up over where Jesus was. So the star wasn't there until the night he was born. And so they lived, I don't know exactly where they lived, but they didn't live, they had to take a long journey, the camels and, all this stuff. And we have no idea how many there were. There were 3 gifts. And it says they were magi, which is a plural form of the word magus or magus. I'm not sure how you say that. And that's where the word magician comes from. They were wise men and astronomers from a distant land, still in the Near East, obviously. But so we know there were at least 2 of them. There could have been many more. And we know there were 3 gifts. So people call them the 3 kings, which they were not kings. That's not anywhere in the Bible. But anyway, and then I thought of all, like, We 3 Kings was one of my favorite songs for every Christmas. And then I thought about all the manger scenes people had in their yards. They always showed the shepherds and the animals and the magi with the gifts and the camels they rode. And then I thought about all the paintings that are in museums and in books. It always shows the shepherds and the magi together there at the stable where Jesus is laying in the manger. That was wrong. And that just blew me away. And at 16, I actually believe that I knew that nobody else in the world knew this except for this Brother Branham guy. And so I was all in. It was like somebody flipped a switch in my brain. And I considered that a spiritual experience. Now I know it was a psychological experience. And so she told me more things. And I had never heard a sermon by William Branham. I had never even been to a church service. And the group is called the End Time Message. It's the cult following of William Branham. William Branham died in 1965. I was only 4 when he died. And actually, most of his followers now probably were not alive before he died. There are some old-timers, older people that were, but, like I said, I'm 63 and I was only 4 when he died. So, this whole thing, I never read a sermon by him. I never heard a sermon on cassette tape by him. I had never been in a message church. That's what we called it. We called it the Message or the End Time Message because he was supposed to be the end time messenger. And I'm not going to go into a lot of theology about what William Branham taught, but I'm just going to talk about the things he taught that actually affected my life. Well, as soon as I got up from my friend, I got some garbage bags. I went into my room and I got all my sinful clothes, which was my pants, my shorts, and then obviously anything immodest, like tank tops. I don't think I had any tube tops. I had some halter tops. And then my sneakers went in because there's no way I would wear sneakers with a dress. And my t-shirts went in because the only thing I wore t-shirts with was jeans. And suddenly I had 3 outfits left. And I dragged the bags into the kitchen where my mom was. I didn't even tell her what was going on. And I asked her if we could give this stuff to Goodwill. And she's like, what is it? And I told her, and she was like, I told her all my clothes. And she's like, no, I'm not giving that to Goodwill. And I told her, I'm never going to wear them again. And so she told me to just stick them in the bottom of my closet. And, she thought it was a phase. And she thought I wanted to do it because I wanted to be part of the same church my friend was in. And all this stuff. And it was definitely a teenage phase that I was going through. And, 2 or 3 weeks later, I would be on to the next thing. And I would be wearing my normal clothes again. Well, unfortunately, she was wrong. I wish she would have been right, because that would have saved me a lot of grief. But that didn't happen that way. And I ended up listening to sermons. They take William Branham. William Branham recorded a bunch of his sermons, and the back then it was cassette tapes. They were distributed all over the place. And then they also transcribed these sermons into, we call them books. They were books. They were more like booklets. And although some of the sermons were quite long, I don't know, that book was probably anywhere between like 30 something and maybe like 60, 70 pages if it was a really long one. But, and we read those all the time. And then I did start going to a message church, and I met other message people, and I was just on cloud nine. I was so happy that I felt like I found the answer to all the questions that I ever had. And I felt forgiven. I just felt euphoric. I was so happy that I was part of this group. It was something it was, how can I put this? It was a really unhealthy, dysfunctional way to meet a normal human need that I had. But I didn't know that at the time. I thought it was the best thing that ever happened to me. So I started the senior year. All that happened in the summer between my junior year and senior year of high school. So I started my senior year, and I didn't wear pants. And everybody was used to seeing me wearing pants every single day. And so all these kids were like, why? How come you don't wear pants? How come you don't wear pants? And I was home, because the Bible says it's wrong for women to wear pants. They're like, it does? Yeah, it does. And so it was this big thing. And what was interesting, so for a long, like, my parents didn't want to buy me any clothes to encourage this phase I was in. In fact, my dress shoes, which were the only shoes I would wear because I was dressing up in a dress, didn't even really fit anymore. They were really hurting my feet. And I think they finally did end up buying me some new shoes because I kept complaining about how bad my feet were hurting. But they weren't going to buy me any more clothes because I had like 2 or 3 big garbage bags full of clothes in the bottom of my closet if I would just get them out and wear them. And they didn't want to encourage this. But they did not have any idea I was in a cult. And they just thought it was a really strict Christian church. And they also thought that I would get sick and tired of not wearing blue jeans and not doing all the stuff that I love to do. And I didn't change my entire lifestyle overnight. I mean, I was still living at home. We had a TV. And this cult, this man, teaches you to not have a TV, not watch TV, not go to the movies, not listen to rock and roll music. Rock and roll music was really bad. And all those were things that I loved doing. Like, why would I give all that up? Why would I give up my blue jeans, t-shirt, and sneakers that I wore every single day to wear these 3 outfits that I had to keep washing over and over and over again? They were outfits. They were dressy outfits that I wore to things like weddings, and my mom would take me to baby showers that people at her work were having, whether I wanted to go or not. And I had to dress up for things like that, and that's why I had those clothes. That's the only reason I had those clothes. But suddenly they became my only clothes. But eventually I did make enough money babysitting, and I bought myself some more clothes. But for a while there, I was doing laundry about every other day and just wearing the same 3 outfits every day. So time went on, and, started school. I met this guy, and we started dating. And actually, I should never have been dating him because he was not a believer in this cult. He was not a believer in William Branham. But I didn't know that wasn't something I wasn't supposed to do. Since I wasn't raised in this thing, there were like 1,000,001 rules that I had no idea even existed when I joined this thing. So I was dating this guy, and then of course I invited him to come to church, and he came to church and he joined it too. And then one day we'd only been dating about 3 months, and we were sitting at a red light, and he asked me to marry him. And I said yes before the light even turned green. That's how much I thought about whether or not I should marry this guy. I thought I was in love with him. He was real nice. He was just real. We had a great first date. You know, we spent hours and hours talking. We saw each other, talking on the phone every single day. Almost every day we did see each other, but the very few days we didn't see each other, we spent hours on the phone together. So I was sure I wanted to marry this guy, but at the same time, I didn't consider it a legally binding contract. Well, we were at church, I don't know, maybe a month later. I was sitting right next to this guy, this boyfriend who was now my fiance, and I'm still a senior in high school. Our first date was actually the day after my 17th birthday. That's how I remember what day it was. It was 1978, September 15th. And my birthday is 1970. My birthday is September 14th. So that's how young I was when I started dating him, and when I got engaged to him, and when I was 16 when I joined this thing. So anyway, we were sitting in church, and the preacher started teaching us about something I did not know was a thing. And what that thing was that once you're engaged to somebody, according to William Branham, you are married in the eyes of God. And if you break up with that person and you marry another person, you're committing adultery. And that if you break up with them, the only thing you can do is never get married, never have a boyfriend. And that was such a huge shock to me, because even though I thought I was in love with this guy, maybe I was in love with him, I don't really know at this point. But all of a sudden I realized, hey, wait, according to the prophet and according to God, me and him are already married. That was so shocking. It was really scary. It felt like a dungeon came down over me. It's like it lowered itself from the ceiling down over me and had me locked in a cage that all of a sudden, that I suddenly became aware of being locked in. And so I decided right then and there that no matter what happened, I would marry him. And that was one of the worst decisions I ever made in my life. The only decision I made that was even worse than that was joining this cult. So in the meantime, things went on, and then gradually, it didn't take long at all actually, he started being really rude. He started disrespecting me in many different ways, and he's showing up an hour and a half late for our dates without calling, and just saying really rude, weird, offensive things. But I never let myself think about the fact that I didn't want to marry him, because not marrying him meant never having a husband, never having kids, never being a wife and a mom, never having the life I wanted to have. So I never let myself think about the fact of whether, do I really want to marry this guy? Because we're already married. And so we did end up getting married a couple of years later. And another thing that happened based on the teachings of William Branham was that, in spite of the fact that I got really, really good grades in school and graduated with academic honors, I never looked into going to college, because he said that higher education is of the devil. And that was highly emphasized in the part of Georgia where we lived, that you don't go to college. And so there were a lot of things I never told my parents, that I was making decisions based on the teachings of the church, because I was really scared they were going to try to make me not be part of that church. So I just told them I didn't want to go, and they weren't happy about it, but they accepted it. They accepted that was my decision, and I didn't go to college. And so this guy and we got married a couple of years later in 1981. And there's a long, that was the beginning of a very long, terrible part of my life. The first years of my life, we lived in a town called Milledgeville, Georgia. And the first 2 years of the marriage, and that were the worst 2 years of my life. It was extremely abusive, and there were all kinds of sex problems that I've talked about in other videos about me being born with an abnormal hymen, and he wouldn't let me go to the doctor. And the reason he was allowed to make the decision about whether or not I go to the doctor was because of the teachings of the cult. He was in charge of everything about me. It was like I was almost more like his child than his wife, although I was also supposed to be super sexual with him. But as far as him having authority over me, it was more like he was my dad than my husband. We were not partners. He was my boss. And he took full advantage of that. And it was a terrible, terrible situation that I won't even go into. I've made a video about being born with an abnormal hymen and what happened with that. And I made a video about the vaginismus that I had following the hymenectomy that I had, which is the only way to get rid of an abnormal hymen. There's no other way. And I will put links to those videos in the description of this video. So we lived our life, and we ended up moving away. It got so bad that I think he even scared himself, and I was terrified. We couldn't have gone on the way we were. I don't know what would have happened, but we decided to move back down here to Florida and get a fresh start on our marriage and kind of start over, which things did get better in some ways, but in most ways they didn't get better. It was really terrible. And also with my cycle was totally messed up, and then with all the issues we were having, I wanted to have a baby really bad, and that wasn't happening. And so we just lived our life that way, year after year after year after year. It was like being in a boxing match and having both hands tied behind my back, and the cult teaching was what tied my hands behind my back, because he had complete power. He had all the power. I had no power. I didn't take my power. I didn't own my power, because I was taught that it would be wrong to do that. That's not what a wife is supposed to do. And I didn't do it. I just survived. I'm not sure how I survived. I was seriously thinking about just leaving this entire planet, because that seemed like the only answer out of this thing that I was part of that was supposed to last until death do us part. And it was very horrible. It was just terrible. And also, so that's the marriage part. The marriage and the cult are inextricably intertwined, because the marriage would not have been what it was if it hadn't been for the cult. I wouldn't even be in the marriage if it hadn't been for the cult. The cult's the reason why I got married. The cult's the reason why I stayed in the marriage for 22 years. And so also, so then at church, it was really scary too. It was like, it's so weird. The church, their teachings abuse you. They control you. They control every aspect of your life. But then it's the church and the teachings of the church about God, and the version of the God you're believing in because of what the cult teaches you, that comforts you because of the abuse you're suffering. So I was suffering abuse at the hands of my ex, and I was suffering abuse at the hands of the church, and then my comfort from the abuse was also coming from the church. It's this really crazy mind game that messes with your head. And it's terrible what they do to you. And for instance, this is just one small example. They would preach about the most horrible things. Like, one of the things William Branham said was that California was gonna sink into the ocean, which that's not an original thought. A lot of people have said that because of the different earthquakes and the San Andreas fault and other faults that are out there. But he said California was gonna sink into the ocean, and that was gonna cause a tidal wave that would go all the way to Kentucky. And I was terrified of that. And he talked about how, he said Russia was going to invade the U.S. and the Russian soldiers, there were going to be like a ground invasion, and the Russian soldiers would be R-wording all the women and the daughters and the wives and all the females. And he talked about so many horrible things, and they would just elaborate on it, and they would harp on it over and over and over and over again. And then and it was really scary stuff. And then they would say, and if this scares you, that means that you are not a god. And I'm like, how the heck is it supposed to not scare me? It was scaring me. I was very terrified of that stuff. But according to them, if it scares you, but it's what God wants to do and it's God's plan, and it does scare you, that means you're not part of God because you're not okay with his plan. Well, that's ridiculous. It's a stupid mind game that they do to people. So I finally was able to have a baby. And that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. We were married 12 years by that point. And my entire perspective and life changed. I went from being a person who was just trying to survive day by day to a mother. And one of the main things a mother does is they protect their children. You take care of your children and you keep your children safe. And by the time she was 3, I knew there was no way in the world I could raise her in this toxic home. Because our home was very toxic. It was, it was just not... I don't know how I lived in it as long as I did. When I look back on my life now, I don't know how I did that. And that was because of the cult. I was there because of the cult. Even though they never forbid you from like getting a divorce from an abusive person. They said you could get a divorce. You were never allowed to remarry unless that original spouse died because you were still married in the eyes of God, which I had no desire to be with another guy. That was never a thing with me. Like, I don't want to leave him because then I can't be with anybody else. That was never a thing with me. I didn't want to be with anybody else. I wanted to live in peace, and I wanted to not be mistreated anymore. But it still felt wrong. Because even though they say the words, the culture is like, you don't leave. And you don't stick up for yourself. You let yourself be abused. Like, Jesus let himself be nailed to the cross. And, like, that was our ultimate example. So, but 3 years later, after I had my daughter, and as she was getting older and becoming more aware of everything, I'm like, there's no way she can live in this kind of home. It's gonna be so toxic. It is so toxic for her, for me, for all of us, but most of all for her. If I would have never had a kid, I don't know what would have happened, because she was the reason that I did something. And I remember sitting on the couch, and I had a phone book in my hand, and I was flipping back and forth between divorce attorney, marriage therapist, back and forth, which one? Both of them were considered wrong. They definitely preached against psychiatry, psychology, seeing a therapist, and that felt really wrong. But it also, I thought, if I'm gonna do something wrong, at least I should try maybe to see if this can possibly be fixed. So I ended up making an appointment with a therapist. One of my big, deep, dark secrets. Oh, another deep, dark secret I had was that I voted. Yeah, and that wasn't, like, I found out later that in some message churches, men were allowed to vote, but women weren't allowed to vote. And in some message churches, women were only allowed to vote if they voted for the same person their husband voted for. But in the message churches I was in, nobody was supposed to vote. William Branham somewhere in some sermon said that it was a total waste of time to vote. He didn't say it was a sin, but he said that it was a complete waste of time to vote, that it was already decided who was going to be president. Voting was just like going through the motions of this sham thing that wasn't even really a thing, and that the president was not determined by who won the election. I mean, let me rephrase that. The president was pre-chosen, and whoever was going to be president by whoever it was, by these people who made this decision, would be the one that won the election, and it didn't matter who you voted for. So most people I knew in the message, men and women, did not vote. But I felt really guilty for not voting. And so that was another secret thing I did. I was a very bad person. I did things like vote and get therapy. So I started seeing this therapist. And then I told my ex about it, and he was very angry. But he came with me, but he wasn't doing therapy. It was a waste of time. And so he stopped coming, but I continued the therapy. And that was the best thing I ever did. And I stayed in therapy. And then he ended up coming back, and we actually did 5 years of marriage counseling. And it improved some things, but it didn't improve it enough to make it where that I would want to be in this marriage, not by a long shot. So anyway, but being in therapy opened my eyes to so many things. And the first huge change I made in my life was I left my ex. I took my daughter, and we moved in with my mom and dad, who live in the same area. So it wasn't like she didn't get to spend time with her dad, and he actually was a good dad. You know, there was this horrible atmosphere that between the two of us were creating in our home, but just him and my daughter, they had a good relationship. I thought he was a good dad. And so that was the first thing I did. But I was still in the cult. But what happened was I had no intention of leaving the cult, and I continued to go to church. But there were several Bible verses and passages in the Bible and several things that William Branham said on a regular basis that had to do with marriage. And every time they would preach about those things, that my ex constantly quoted and like pounded me over the head with them and told me what a failure I was as a Christian and as a wife, and, you know, just that I was such an awful person, that whenever they would talk about those things, I would have a panic attack in church. And more, I just did not want to go to church. I didn't feel like I belonged there. And then one day I hallucinated in church. And I knew I was hallucinating. I found out you don't have, like, if you see something, mine was visual hallucination. And if you see something, even if you know it's not real, it's still a hallucination if you actually see it. And I knew it wasn't real, but I knew I was looking right at it. And that was really scary. And I thought, this place is pushing me over the edge. So then I finally, after hearing them preach the same things that I was getting beat over the head with all those years about being a terrible wife and like, why, you know, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, I'm not being submissive, I'm not being obedient, I'm not doing everything he wants me to do. And his big theme in the marriage was, I get what I want, when I want it, where I want it, and how I want it. And if he didn't get those things, then I was a bad wife. And I mean in every area of life. And I'm not going to elaborate on that. I don't think I need to. Well, anyway, I finally had to admit to myself, I do not believe everything Brother Branham taught. Because I don't believe the stuff he said about marriage. I don't believe there was any reason that my ex had to have all that power and control over me. And I don't feel like there was any reason I needed to obey him when he told me to do all these things that were very detrimental to my mental health and my happiness and my peace of mind. So I finally realized, like, I knew kind of in the back of my mind, but I was kind of suppressing it because I didn't want to admit that I didn't believe everything William Branham said. Because another thing he said was that if you believe this message 99.99%, then you're not a believer. You have to believe it 100%. And he's compared people who only believe it 99.99% to Eve when she believed the serpent in the garden instead of what God said. And when I realized that, I thought, I don't believe what he said about marriage. I don't care, because I'm a living example of how wrong it is what he taught about marriage. And so I had to admit, I don't believe this 100%. There's part of it I don't believe. And according to Brother Branham, if I don't believe it all, I'm not even a believer. And if I'm not even a believer, why am I torturing myself by going to church? So I stopped going. And it was very scary. I felt very guilty about that. And the thing was, I still believed everything else he said. But that was like the first hole, the first chink in the armor, the first like hole in this big wall. So I stopped going to church, and that was a big thing. It was very emotional and scary. And I actually called my pastor, told him I was taking a break. You know, I needed to do that. And he prayed with me. He was very kind. You know, I had a very atypical experience with the church from everything I've heard from other people. I know my experience. I didn't realize how unusual my experience was until I've heard from other people online about what they went through when they left the message. When they left the message, they were treated terribly. But I was never treated terribly. My pastor prayed for me, and everybody was really nice to me. Most people never reached out to me. Only one person reached out to me. And that was one of my closest friends in the message. And she loved me. She reached out to me, and I loved her. You know, it wasn't like I didn't. And so she kept calling me, and she even came over to my house one day, and she looked at me, and she had tears in her eyes, and she's like, "Don't you miss us?" And it had never crossed my mind until she said that. No, I don't miss you guys. Which was really weird, considering that they were my best friends for about the last 20 years. How do I just walk away from all my friends and not even miss them? But this teaching, this cult teaching, was so toxic that I wanted nothing to do with anything even associated with it, including all the people that I love so much. And so I walked away. But I was terrified. I was convinced that I would go to a worse place in hell than Hitler would, or any other person who committed genocide, because I had the truth of God for our day and I threw it away. And that makes you like the worst person that ever existed. People who do that, you know, they're worse than any mass murderer or genocidal dictator. I believed that for a long time. I was so scared. I didn't change the way I dressed or anything about the way I looked for about 3 years. And then when I finally did start wearing pants, I was so paranoid that I was going to run into somebody from church. And finally, I was just living in fear of this so much that I knew I had a good idea where they would be on Sunday afternoon after church eating lunch. And I went there one day in pants. And I was right. They were there. A bunch of people from the church were there. And they were very nice to me. But I walked up to the table in my blue jeans. And I said hi to them. And they were all smiles. Like, oh, hi, you know, and everything. And that was, you know, it was very awkward. But I broke down that barrier of them seeing me in pants. And then I no longer had this huge phobia of being in public. And that somebody from the church would see me, because they did see me. I had on pants. I had on earrings, which is another thing you're not supposed to have. And you're not supposed to make a hole in your body to hang jewelry from. It's okay to wear a little bit of jewelry, but never earrings. So anyway, for a long time, for the next 16 years actually, since I left the cult, I basically went back and forth between hating God, being so rageful and angry at God, and being terrified of God, and all as an overarching thing of all that is just telling myself that God didn't exist. But if he doesn't exist, then how come I'm scared of him, and how come I'm mad at him, and how come I hate him for everything that I went through? So gradually over the years, those feelings got less intense. And I left in 2004. YouTube started in 2005. So there wasn't even a YouTube to look at. And I tried to find things about this cult online, and I really couldn't find much. I found a little here and there, but not much. And then I just lived my life. And what I ended up doing, you know, I didn't have any marketable skills. I had no education. But I was really blessed because my daughter and I lived with my mom and dad while I went to vocational school, and I learned how to become a medical coder. And then I got a job at the hospital that I wanted to work at. And I had a career for the first time in my entire life, not just a job. And then I was able to buy a house, which is the house that you see the curtains of and the couch that's in that I'm sitting on. Same house. That was in 2005. I moved here with my daughter. And because of being able to get educated, train, and having a good job, I was able to, have a good life. And then we got divorced, and my ex got remarried right away. And he, we actually worked really well together as co-parents. We weren't husband and wife anymore, and we both made our daughter our top priority. And I'm really proud of him, and I'm really proud of me for what good co-parents we were. We didn't do it perfectly because nobody does, but we did the best we could, and I think we did a good job. And we didn't fight anymore, almost ever. And that was great. And I lived my life, and he lived his. And so then I don't know exactly when, but I started finding out, there's YouTube channels about the message. YouTube channels that are telling the truth about this thing that I was in for 28 years. I joined it when I was 16. I left it when I was 44. So like all my 20s, all my 30s were given to this thing. Part of my 40s, part of my teens. I call the 80s and 90s my cultural black hole, because if you have cultural references, I probably won't get them. And after I left, I didn't really throw myself into current popular culture like a lot of people do. I just wasn't that interested. I went back to listening to the music that I missed so much, like the Beatles and Cat Stevens. And I'm really into the music of the 60s and 70s. I don't know much about modern music. And I don't really know much about, I don't have a TV. That's another, we lived, my ex actually left the message about 5 years before I left him. And he got a TV, which we didn't have a TV from the time, we got married in 1981. So we didn't have a TV for probably about 18 years, or maybe a little bit less. Then he got this little TV, and he hooked it up to a video player, a VHS player, and put it in the side room of our house. So we couldn't still really watch TV, but you could watch videos on it. And he had that. So I don't know, I'm just not that interested in popular culture in general. There are things if I'm interested in something, I do a deep dive into it. And if I'm not interested in something, I just basically ignore it. So even though I haven't been in the cult since 2005, I still don't know a lot of cultural references. So, and I'm fine with that. I don't have a problem with that. And so then after 16 years, I met a friend who was a Christian. And he talked a lot about Christianity. And I like to talk about Christianity as a subject. And he wasn't trying to convert me to Christianity, but it was something we talked about a lot, along with a lot of other things that we were both interested in. And one day I realized I was scared of God for the first time, and I don't know how long. I hadn't been scared of God for a long time. God was just kind of something that I just did my best not to think about. I didn't think all the time like, oh, I'm scared of God, or I hate God, or I'm mad at God. I mean, sometimes I thought about stuff like that, but very rarely compared to when I first left the cult. And I was just living my life. But then one day I thought, I'm really scared God is going to make something really bad happen to me. Because when I thought of God, I thought of a very punitive God, because that was the God I learned about in the cult. That God was not a God of grace. That God was a God of judgment and a God of punishment that God was a scary God. I remember once when I was still in the cult, I had messed up and I told somebody something I wasn't supposed to tell them. It was supposed to be, confidential, and I felt really terrible about that. And right, and I sat down to eat a sandwich, and I was by myself. I was going to eat lunch. I could not eat because I was just so positive that God was going to make me choke on the sandwich and die, because to punish me for the mistake I'd made, even though I repented for it, and even though I felt very bad about saying this thing that wasn't supposed to be said to a certain person. And I was like, I don't even remember all the details, but I remember how scared I was. And that's the kind of God I was used to, a really scary, punitive God, and also a God that I was constantly praying to and asking him to deliver me from this situation, and nothing was happening. And you could say, well, it did happen because you're not in it anymore, and that is one way to look at it. But I don't know. I don't even want to get into all that. But what I will say is that when I started thinking about God seriously again, right away, it was like, God is going to make something really bad happen to me. So I asked this friend of mine to pray with me, which he was probably really surprised. I asked him to pray that nothing bad would happen to me. So he did. And through knowing this friend, I came back to God. And I became, I guess basically you could say, an evangelical Christian. And then shortly after that, the pandemic happened. And for about 2 or 3 years, I studied the Bible. And I tried really hard to not look at it through the lens of Branham. Because when I was in the cult, I studied the Bible a lot, which some people in that cult don't study the Bible. They study William Branham's sermons. And some people just don't study anything. But a lot of people who are very studious, do spend a lot more time studying what William Branham said than what the Bible says. But I studied both a lot. But what I didn't know is that I was reading the Bible through the lens of Branham. So, people have this misconception that Christians who are in a Christian cult, as if there is such a thing, just don't read their Bibles. Because if they did, they would see duh, what the thing you're in is wrong. But what they don't understand is if you're looking through a distorted lens of the cult leader and what the cult leader says, you can study the Bible all you want and you might not see the truth. And I find that very frustrating. Another thing I find very frustrating is people think that the only people who join cults are stupid people, dumb people, gullible people. And that's just not true. Thought reform techniques are effective on everybody. One of the two main things that make people vulnerable to cults, from everything I've read, is you're in a time of transition, a difficult time in your life. Now, what teenager is not in a time of transition? That's what teenage years are, a time of transition between being a child and being an adult. So all teenagers are in a time of transition, which makes them vulnerable, and teenagers are often the ones that join cults. I'm not saying they're the only ones by a long shot, but teenagers are very vulnerable to cults and other weird ideas. The second thing that makes people very vulnerable to cults is being very idealistic and wanting to change the world. Well, who's idealistic? Teenagers. And so when you combine an idealistic type of personality with being in a difficult transition, that can make you very vulnerable, because you feel like, the way I felt was that the regular world, the traditional world, the world that everybody I knew lived in, obviously didn't know how to do it right. They didn't know how to run the world. Duh, look at it. So this alternative thing over here, who says they have all the answers, they have the answers of how the way things should be and what people should do. So that was a lot of why I joined the cult. And people of all ages join cults, but often if you trace it back, you will find they are in a period of difficult transition, and that's what made them vulnerable. And then a person from a cult comes along and tries to recruit them, and then they're meeting that need, that this hole they feel like they have inside their life. That's often what will pull somebody into a cult. And I don't care how smart you are, if you are open to be this group that you have no idea is a cult, and they start using their love bombing and all the other thought reform techniques on you, it will work. I hate to say it, but you don't have to be a dumb person to be vulnerable to thought reform techniques. Incredibly intelligent people are in cults. And I'm not saying I'm one of them, but I am saying that it is not a matter of intelligence to join a cult. And I see so many comments on so many YouTube videos, because I watch a lot of cult YouTube videos, and it's really frustrating for me. So anyway, I did become an evangelical Christian, and I didn't go to church because it was during lockdown. And then the idea of going to church was actually very triggering to me. And one thing I didn't know is that I get triggered every time I'm around an altar call. Even if I see one on a video, I do not like altar calls. And I know why. That's because of terrible experiences that I had when I was only 10. And it's just, I don't know how to describe it. I cannot stand altar calls. And I'm not saying churches shouldn't do them, but I don't want to be around when they do. And that's my own personal psychic injury, or psychological injury is probably a better way to put it. It triggers me. But then after 2, maybe 3 years, I'm not even sure, I realized there were several things in the Bible that I didn't believe and that were not okay with me. One of them was slavery. The Bible does not speak against slavery. It regulates slavery. And in the Old Testament, there are 2 versions of slavery. Jewish people, if Jewish people held Jewish people as slaves, they had one set of rules. And they were much more mild than, for instance, the slavery in the American South before the Civil War. But when the Jewish people held captives of war, who were the Gentiles, they had very stringent rules for those people. And it was a lot worse of a version of slavery. Plus, slavery is evil. Everybody believes that. And why is it regulated in the Bible? Why isn't it forbidden? And even though Paul and Jesus did not, I don't want to say Jesus didn't have the power. Jesus, living his life as the itinerant Jewish preacher that he lived for 3.5 years before he was crucified and then came back from the dead, as that, instead of living as God, even though he was healing people and casting out demons and stuff like that. And Paul did not have the power to abolish slavery in the Roman Empire, obviously. But why didn't they speak out against it? That really bothers me. Another thing is that God ordered his children to commit genocide in the Old Testament. And whether people like that word or don't like that word, genocide just means wiping out a race of people. And even though they didn't really end up wiping them out, they were ordered to do that. If the stories in the Old Testament are literally true, I'm not saying they are, I'm not saying they're not. But just the stories in the Old Testament have God telling people to commit genocide. And that really bothers me. The other thing that really bothers me is hell. And people say, well, God doesn't send people to hell. People send themselves to hell. And, you can spin it whatever way you want. But one analogy I heard really made a lot of sense. It's like, so I have a daughter. And if my daughter said, Mom, I don't love you. I don't like you. I don't even believe you're my mother. I don't want anything to do with you. I would not lock her in a car and pour gasoline all over her and all over the car and set it on fire and make it burn for all eternity. I just wouldn't do that. And I'm not more moral than the God of the universe. But who would do that? So I just can't believe in that. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm right. I hope that's wrong, is what I meant to say. And then the thing that has affected me the most, of course, is the thing that the Bible says about women. And it talks about women have to obey their husbands, that you have to obey him as unto the Lord. And I was taught that that meant that you have to obey him to the point that, like, he's God. It also says that the wife's body is her husband, belongs to her husband, and that the husband's body belongs to his wife. And that was kind of like my ex-husband's ace in the hole. My body was his property. And that was reinforced in the cult, and it's in the Bible. And I don't in any way, shape, or form believe that the Bible, I think that was written in a book by Paul. I don't believe Paul meant that anyone is supposed to use that to abuse another person. I don't believe that it was ever meant that way, and that I should have never taken it that way, but I did. And that was because of what the cult taught. And it was basically I was his property. My body was his property to do with as he will. And I don't ever want to be anybody's property again. I want to belong to myself. And so I went through a very difficult deconstruction process. First, I deconstructed from the cult to just basic normal life. Then I became an evangelical Christian, and then I deconstructed from that. And at this point in my life, I'm very interested in the Bible. But the way I approach the Bible now is more along the lines of somebody like Bart Ehrman and a Bible scholar named Dan McClellan. I do not believe the Bible is inherently truth. I don't believe it's infallible. I don't believe it's inspired. I believe it's a lot of different ancient writings that were put together by a lot of different people that had a lot of different agendas. And there's quite a few contradictory things in the Bible. And I remember noticing that all the way back when I was in the cult and wondering, how do these two things go together without contradicting each other? Because obviously the Bible doesn't contradict itself, but actually obviously it does. And that's where I come from, and as far as how I feel in my spiritual life right now. So I don't think there's anything else to say. That's where I am right now. And I feel more at peace than I have for so long. I'm happier than I have been for a really long time. And I'm not afraid of God anymore. And there are probably some people who watch this video that will say, well, you should be more afraid of God, lady, now than you ever have in your life. And all I can say is I hope they're wrong. I'm not claiming I have all the answers. I don't. Not by a long shot. But I don't think anybody else does either. And I definitely don't believe there's anybody like William that exists on the earth, or that was ever meant to exist on the earth at this point in time, who has all the answers like William Branham claimed he did. And so thank you for being interested in my story and what happened to me in joining a cult after not being raised in a cult and spending the majority of my life. I spent the majority of my adult life in a cult. If you include my entire life, it's still close to half of it in a cult. A very damaging, doomsday, destructive cult that is harder on women than anybody. And that was a very terrible thing that caused all kinds of chaos and pain and negativity in my life, and all kinds of abuse and damage. And I would ask every one of you, if you know somebody that's in a cult, don't just start like bombarding them with anti-cult stuff, because that's not going to work. But there is a book called, I think it's called Combating Cult Mind Control by Dr. Steve Hassan. And I'm going to put a link to that book in the description of this video, because that is the best book I've ever read about what cults do to people, how they do it, and how to help people get out of cults. And it explains how people get into cults, because this guy was a normal guy and he was 19 and he ended up getting sucked into the Mooney cult. And then he got out, became a psychologist, and became a cult expert. And there's also a channel on YouTube called Leaving the Message. There are other channels on YouTube also too about exposing this end time message William Branham cult. There are tons of pro Branham things on YouTube. Please don't go to them. Please do not listen to anything that man has to say. It's disgusting. If you heard some of the things he had to say, which I'm going to put some links in my video. I made a video about the dress code that they had for men and for women, which the one for women is like 5 times as long as one for men. And I made one about, the horrible things William Branham said about women. It's absolutely disgusting what he said about us. He hated women. And so I'll put all kinds of links in my description to that book and to the different videos. But I will also thank you for listening to this tale of what happened to me. And thank you. And please give this video a thumbs up if you like it. And subscribe to this channel. And I'm going to sneeze. Subscribe to this channel and also give me a comment. I would love to hear from you what... Excuse me, I'm sorry. I would love to have a comment from you and turn this from a monologue into a dialogue, because I really appreciate everyone who watches my videos and wants to know about what I think and what I went through and what happened to me. But I would love to hear what happened to you guys. I would love to hear what you think and what you feel about all this and anything else that you would like to tell me. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a really good day. Bye.